Tonight, the major revelation in the search for Kristin Smart. Investigators now say they found evidence suggesting human remains were present at the home of her killer's mother.
We believe that a human remains were there at one time or still there. So we can't call it Kristin, but we think there's evidence to support human remains.
May 25th, 1996, San Luis Obispo, California. A 19-year-old girl walked home from a party at Cal Poly and never made it back to her dorm. 6 months earlier, a woman reported the man who would later be convicted of killing her. 2 months after that, another woman reported him too. The university had his name in writing, twice, and did nothing. When she vanished, campus police waited 4 days to open a file and 16 days to search his dorm room. Prosecutors say the killer's father buried her body beneath his own deck, then dug it up and moved it. A wiretapped call caught the killer's mother telling her son to study a true crime podcast, so they could, in her words, punch holes in it. A mother's instinct to protect her child, and, in doing so, she stood between a murdered girl and the justice she was owed. She has never been charged. In May 2026, investigators were back at her house, testing the soil again. They still don't know where Kristin is. This is the story of a girl who did everything right, and a university, a police department, and a family that all had the chance to stop it, and didn't. May 25th, 1996. 6 months into her freshman year at California Polytechnic State University, Kristin Smart was struggling. She was carrying a full course load, working an early morning lifeguard shift, and managing symptoms of ADHD that made the workload harder to keep up with. At one point that year, she called her mother and said she wanted to quit. Her mother wrote back, urging her to stay. Kristin stayed. On the afternoon of Friday, May 24th, something went right for once. She learned she'd been given a chance to make up an exam she'd missed earlier in the semester. For a student who had been quietly falling behind for months, it was real news, and she wanted to share it. At 5:30 that evening, she called her parents' house in Stockton. No one answered. She left a voicemail. Good news, she said. She'd call again Sunday and explain everything then. That Sunday call never came. It was Memorial Day weekend, and most of the Cal Poly campus had cleared out for the holiday. Kristin didn't want to spend the night alone. She went to the room of a friend and fellow freshman, Margarita Campos, and asked her to come find a party. Campos was tired and didn't want to go. Kristin pushed. Eventually, Campos agreed. Before they left, Kristin realized she didn't have her dorm key. She'd misplaced it days earlier. She had no wallet either, no cash, no identification. Campos handed over her own room key so Kristin could get back in later, and the two set out into the night. Their first stop was quiet. A small apartment gathering, a handful of people, a television running in the background. It wasn't what either of them was looking for. They left. Kristin wanted to keep looking. Campos didn't. Just before midnight, the two parted ways at a street corner. Campos turned back toward the dorms. Kristin kept walking, alone, still holding onto Campos's key. A short distance further down the road, she found what she'd been looking for. A party, spilling out of a house, just off campus. Loud enough to hear from the street. Dozens of students inside. Kristin Smart walked in by herself and introduced herself to the room, using a name that wasn't her own. I'm genuinely glad you're here for this one. If this is your first time on the channel, subscribe. We cover cases like this every week. And comment below, let me know where you're watching from. Inside the party, Kristin was social. She talked easily, moved between groups, pulled a student named Trevor Bolter aside at one point to tell him about someone across the room she found attractive. To anyone watching, it looked like an ordinary Friday night. But people who were there noticed something specific afterward. Kristin wasn't drinking much. Several guests later told investigators they barely saw her with a cup in her hand. That detail would matter because of what happened next. Around 2 a.m., as the party was winding down, one of the hosts, Tim Davis, stepped outside to start clearing people off the property. On the neighbor's lawn, he found Kristin. She was unconscious and too cold to stand on her own. Davis got her upright. A fellow student, Cheryl Anderson, offered to help walk her back toward the dorms, and the three of them set out into the dark together. They hadn't gone far when another student approached from behind. He introduced himself as Paul Flores and said he was heading the same direction. Without being asked, he stepped in, put an arm around Kristin's waist, and told Davis and Anderson he'd take it from there. Cheryl Anderson stayed close for a while longer. She'd later describe how Flores held on to Kristin, not loosely, the way someone helping a stranger might, but firmly, guiding her, keeping her moving. Uneasy about leaving Kristin with him, Anderson stayed until she reached her own dorm. Before she went inside, she asked Flores directly to make sure Kristin got home safely. He told her he would. Then Anderson watched the two of them continue on alone, down the path toward the dorms. The distance remaining between Paul Flores's dormitory and Kristin's was 40 yards, a walk that takes less than a minute. By his own account, Flores said he walked Kristin that far, watched her continue on alone, and went to bed. No one saw Kristin Smart again. By Saturday morning, Kristin's roommate found her backpack sitting exactly where she'd left it, untouched. When Sunday passed without the phone call she'd promised, friends began asking around campus. The answer was always the same. No one had seen her. On Monday, 4 days after the party, Kristin's friends went to campus police and asked them to open a missing person case. They were turned away. Officers suggested Kristin had likely left for the long weekend on her own and pointed to her love of travel as a possible explanation, floating that she might have simply flown to Hawaii. She had taken no luggage. She had no wallet, no identification, and no money with her. It would be 4 days before campus police treated her disappearance as anything other than a college student skipping town. 9 months earlier, the university already had reason to be watching Paul Flores. In December 1995, a Cal Poly student reported him to police. She said he had climbed the outside trellis of her apartment building at night to look in on her from her balcony. Officers responded, told him to get down, and sent him home. No charges were filed. No further action was taken. In March 1996, it happened again. More than one student filed a report, describing a pattern, Flores following them, calling repeatedly, refusing to stop. In one case, he was found attempting to climb onto a balcony to get inside an apartment. Again, there was no follow-up, no disciplinary action, and no record that the university connected these reports to one another. 2 months later, Kristin disappeared with Flores as the last person seen beside her. Even after her disappearance became a criminal investigation, the response remained slow. Flores's dormitory room went unsealed for over 2 weeks. Investigators did not search it until 16 days after Kristin vanished, time in which the room could be entered, cleaned, or altered by anyone with access to it. A full forensic examination took even longer. Campus police did not have a crime scene investigator on staff, and struggled to borrow one from a neighboring department. It took 31 days from the night Kristin disappeared for investigators to conduct a formal crime scene investigation of the room belonging to the last person seen with her. By the time that investigation happened, more than a month had passed since 2 written reports already sat in the university's own files, warning that Paul Flores was a young man other women had already tried to warn them about. This case has more buried in it than most coverage ever shows you. Subscribe, because it doesn't get any easier to hear from here. Investigators first spoke with Paul Flores 5 days after Kristin disappeared. He agreed to a voluntary interview and told them he had not touched or spoken to Kristin at the party, that he found her walking normally on the way back to the dorms, not leaning on him, and that he didn't find her attractive. Multiple witnesses who were there that night told investigators the opposite. Cheryl Anderson, who walked with them part of the way, said Flores had his arm around Kristin's waist the entire time, and that before she left them, Flores asked her for a kiss. Flores denied that too. There was also his eye. Investigators noticed a mark days after Kristin vanished and asked him about it. His answer changed each time he was asked. First, he said he'd gotten it playing basketball. When a friend told police Flores already had the bruise before that game started, Flores offered a new explanation. He'd hit his eye on the steering wheel of his truck while removing a car stereo in the middle of the night. When investigators pressed him on why his story kept changing, Flores said it didn't matter, because it had happened days earlier anyway. Asked to explain further, he told them, "Why does it matter if I leave out little details?" It was a strange thing to say about a bruise, but it was consistent with everything else investigators were hearing from him. A pattern of specific denials, each one contradicted by someone who had been there that night. By the summer of 1996, investigators had no confession, no body, and no crime scene. What they had was a young man who had walked away with Kristin Smart and told them, repeatedly, that almost nothing had happened, while the people around him kept saying otherwise. Over the next decade, investigators returned to the case in pieces. In the days after Kristin disappeared, cadaver dogs were brought into Paul Flores's dorm room. They alerted, according to investigators, to something inside. No body was found, and the search produced no charges. Searches continued intermittently over the years that followed, some using cadaver dogs, at properties connected to the Flores family. None led to an arrest. One piece of physical evidence surfaced by chance, years later, and was lost by the people meant to protect it. A woman renting a house once tied to Paul Flores's mother found a small earring in the yard, one she believed matched what Kristin had been wearing the night she disappeared. She brought it to investigators. It was never logged into evidence. By the time Kristin's family learned it existed, police told them it was gone. The same tenant later described hearing a faint beeping sound coming from the yard early each morning, the kind a digital watch makes. She and her family searched for it repeatedly and never found the source. When Kristin's mother, Denise, eventually heard this account years later, she recognized the detail immediately. Kristin's watch alarm had been set for early morning, for a job that started before sunrise. None of it, on its own, was enough. For years, the case moved forward in fragments, evidence collected, and sometimes lost, leads followed, and sometimes abandoned, while the man who walked Kristin, those final 40 yards, continued living his life freely. By 2019, the case had gone cold in every official sense. No arrest, no charges, 23 years of silence. That year, a musician and news consultant named Chris Lambert began investigating the case seriously. He'd grown up near the campus and had passed Kristin's missing person billboard most of his life. In September 2019, he launched a podcast called Your Own Backyard, structured around one recurring question: what actually happened to Kristin Smart? Lambert had no police authority. What he offered instead was something the official investigation never had: a public, repeated reminder that the statute of limitations had expired on almost everything except murder itself, meaning witnesses could speak without fear of being charged for what they'd done or seen decades earlier. People began coming forward. One of them was Jennifer Hudson. In the summer of 1996, she was 17, at a small gathering around a backyard skate ramp outside Arroyo Grande, when a radio broadcast played a public appeal for information about Kristin's disappearance. Sitting nearby was Paul Flores, someone Hudson barely knew. After the broadcast, according to her later testimony, Flores calmly told her he had killed Kristin and buried her body on a property he had access to nearby. Hudson would later describe his expression as flat, without any hint that he was joking. She left shortly after. She didn't tell anyone in law enforcement, not for over 20 years. She was 17, frightened, and didn't believe anyone would act on what she'd heard. It wasn't until 2019, after hearing about Lambert's podcast through a friend, that Hudson finally came forward to investigators. Her account, once reported, gave police something they'd never had: a direct, specific admission, tied to an actual location, from someone with no reason to lie. The renewed pressure also turned investigators back toward the Flores family itself. In January 2020, authorities obtained legal authorization to record phone calls involving Paul, his father Ruben, and his mother Susan. In one recorded call that same month, Susan told her son to study the podcast closely, so the two of them could, in her words, find ways to punch holes in it. By the end of 2020, a case that had sat dormant for over 2 decades was moving again, driven less by new forensic technology than by one specific, decades-old memory finally spoken out loud. A 17-year-old carried that memory alone for 23 years. If you were in her position back then, would you have come forward or stayed quiet? Let us know below. And also click the subscribe button. It means a lot to us. On April 13th, 2021, almost exactly 25 years after Kristin disappeared, investigators moved on 2 addresses at once. Paul Flores was arrested in Southern California. His father, Ruben, was arrested the same day at his home in Arroyo Grande. Paul was charged with murder. Ruben was charged as an accessory, accused of helping conceal Kristin's body. The case against Ruben centered on his property. Investigators had already searched it with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. Beneath the deck, an archaeologist working the site identified dark staining in the soil, roughly 2 feet down, consistent with human decomposition. Samples from that section also tested positive for human blood. Prosecutors argued the pattern was consistent with a body having been buried there and later removed. The defense challenged the science directly. A forensic expert testified that the blood detection test used could produce false positives, and that blood itself tends to break down quickly in soil, meaning a positive result didn't necessarily indicate what prosecutors claimed. The soil's pH level, which can affect the test, had never been separately measured. Under cross-examination, even the archaeologist acknowledged the staining could theoretically have come from plant roots, not human remains. It left investigators with something, but not everything, physical evidence strong enough to support an arrest and a criminal case, but not conclusive enough, on its own, to say definitively what had happened beneath that deck, or when. What the evidence could not do was answer the question that mattered most to Kristin's family. Even with an arrest, even with soil samples and specialized equipment, no one could say where she actually was. The trial was moved out of San Luis Obispo County entirely. After 26 years of local coverage, finding an impartial jury there was considered unrealistic. Proceedings were held roughly 100 miles north, in Monterey County, running for close to 3 months, with more than 50 witnesses called. Paul and Ruben Flores were tried at the same time, in the same courtroom, in front of 2 separate juries reaching independent verdicts. Jennifer Hudson's testimony became one of the trial's most difficult moments. Under cross-examination, the defense questioned her memory, her past struggles, and why she waited over 2 decades to come forward. She broke down on the stand more than once, telling the court she felt partially responsible for prolonging the Smart family's suffering by staying silent as long as she had. On October 18, 2022, the verdicts came back. Paul Flores was found guilty of first-degree murder. In a separate but simultaneous decision, Ruben Flores was found not guilty of accessory after the fact. Prosecutors had built their case on the timeline, the inconsistencies in Paul's own statements, Hudson's account, and the physical evidence tied to his father's property. It was enough to convict Paul. It was not enough to convict Ruben. On March 10, 2023, Paul Flores was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison and ordered to register as a sex offender for the remainder of his life. Addressing him directly, the judge said that for 25 years, he had lived freely in the community, while Kristin's family lived through what she described as a nightmare. Outside the courthouse, Kristin's sister, Lindsay, described the 26 years she had spent looking at her sister's empty chair at family gatherings. A verdict had finally arrived. Kristin had not. In May 2023, Cal Poly's president publicly apologized to the Smart family, saying the university recognized that things should have been handled differently in 1996. It was the first time the university had acknowledged, on the record, that its own response had failed Kristin. That apology is what led the family to act. According to their attorneys, they hadn't understood the extent of the university's failures until hearing it stated plainly by the person now running the institution. In January 2024, Kristin's parents and siblings filed a lawsuit against Cal Poly, alleging negligence, wrongful death, and emotional distress, and citing the university's failure to act on prior reports against Flores and its delayed, mishandled investigation into her disappearance. The university's response was procedural. Through the California Attorney General's office, Cal Poly moved to have the case dismissed, arguing the family had missed required filing deadlines and lacked legal standing to bring the claims at all. As of the most recent filings, the The case remains unresolved, caught in arguments over technicalities rather than a hearing on what actually happened. Meanwhile, the physical search for Kristin has never fully stopped. In May 2026, 30 years after she disappeared, investigators returned to a property in Arroyo Grande, connected to Paul Flores' mother, Susan. Using updated ground-penetrating radar and soil analysis, they identified signs consistent with human remains having been present on the property at some point. The search concluded days later. Kristin was not found there. Susan Flores has never been charged with any crime. Sheriff Ian Parkinson has described her, publicly, as someone who has remained a person of interest for years. Kristin Smart's case ended, in the way the legal system defines an ending. A trial happened, a verdict was reached, a sentence was handed down. But for her family, none of that has meant closure. Her remains have never been recovered. The institution that was supposed to protect her has spent over a year fighting, in court, over whether it even has to answer for what happened. And as recently as 2 months ago, investigators were still searching a backyard in Arroyo Grande, still testing soil, still looking. 30 years after Kristin Smart disappeared, most of the legal questions in her case have been answered. The most basic one hasn't. Where is she? If you're still here, you're the reason this channel exists. Subscribe, hit the bell, don't miss the next one.